Imagine sitting down at a fancy restaurant, excited to enjoy a nice meal after a long day. You've dressed up, made a reservation, and are ready to treat yourself to something special. But little do you know, this evening is about to take a shocking turn. A seemingly innocent dinner date quickly spirals into something you'd never expect. Meet Sarah, a woman who thought she was simply going out to enjoy a peaceful evening with her husband. Unbeknownst to her, the night would turn into a public humiliation that would leave her reeling. From the moment they walked in, everything seemed normal. The restaurant was upscale, the ambience elegant, and the staff appeared to be professional. But then there was the waiter. At first, he seemed polite. His greeting was typical. The menu offered a wide variety of choices, and he didn't think much of Sarah or her husband. But as the evening progressed, something changed. The waiter, who had been trained to provide excellent service, suddenly began acting uncomfortably. His words weren't just awkward, they were cold. And then, as Sarah attempted to order, his attitude took a darker turn. He sneered at her request, dismissing her with a snide comment about her choice of dish. This was not the kind of service one would expect at a high-end restaurant. At first, Sarah thought it was an isolated incident. Perhaps the waiter was having a bad day. Maybe he was just stressed. But the more he interacted with her, the more it became clear his behavior wasn't a mistake. There was something deeply personal in his tone. With each passing minute, the insults became sharper, more cutting, and for Sarah, more difficult to ignore. What could have possibly made this waiter so rude to her? As the night wore on, Sarah's husband tried to brush it off, offering a few polite comments to smooth things over. But the waiter's attitude was unwavering. He didn't just treat her poorly. He was actively rude and dismissive, as if she didn't belong there. And to make matters worse, it wasn't just the way he was speaking to her. His actions, his pointed looks, his sarcastic remarks, made it clear that this wasn't a simple case of bad service. There was something deeply rooted in his behavior, something Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on. Sarah's frustration grew with every passing moment. She had been polite. She had been patient. But the waiter seemed to go out of his way to make her feel small, insignificant, and out of place. She thought about standing up for herself, about confronting him directly. But there was a part of her that wasn't sure if it was worth it. What if she was just overreacting? What if she was imagining things? After all, she was just a customer. But then, as Sarah reached for her drink, the waiter leaned in with a whisper that sent a chill down her spine. "You're not worth the attention," he said, just loud enough for her to hear. The words hit her like a punch in the gut. She stared at him, shocked and confused. What was happening? Why was he treating her this way? It wasn't until later, when the night took an unexpected turn, that Sarah would discover the shocking reason behind the waiter's hostility. As the meal came to an end, and Sarah and her husband prepared to leave, the restaurant manager walked over to their table. He had a calm, measured look on his face, nothing unusual about him. But what he said next would change everything. "Excuse me," the manager said politely. "I hope everything was to your satisfaction this evening." Before Sarah could respond, the waiter, who had been serving them all night, looked up at the manager and said something that left Sarah speechless. The manager's expression shifted, and suddenly, the atmosphere in the restaurant felt heavy, like a storm was rolling in. It was then that Sarah realized who she was, or rather, what she was about to become. She wasn't just a random woman sitting at a table. She wasn't just another diner. Sarah's husband had kept a secret from her, one that would soon be revealed. The waiter had no idea who Sarah really was, or who she was connected to. He had no idea that, at that very moment, Sarah was more than just a customer at his table. She was someone with influence, someone who held more power than he could ever imagine. The manager's next words confirmed what Sarah had feared. "Sir," he said to the waiter, "you don't seem to realize who you're speaking to." The waiter's face turned pale. His cocky, condescending attitude from earlier seemed to vanish in an instant. His jaw tightened as he realized who Sarah was. The look of shock on his face said it all. He had just humiliated the wife of the man who owned the very restaurant he worked at. As the realization hit him, the weight of his actions became all too clear. The moment he had disrespected Sarah, he had crossed a line he would never be able to undo. Now he had no choice but to face the consequences. Would he apologize? Would he try to make amends? Or would he simply try to cover up his mistake and hope to escape the fallout? As Sarah stood there, stunned and speechless, her husband's calm demeanor shifted. What would he do next? Would he defend his wife, or let the situation unfold in a way that no one could have predicted? The tension in the air was palpable. The waiter's fate was sealed in that moment, but Sarah's story was far from over. This shocking twist was just the beginning. The next part of this story will reveal the fallout from the waiter's actions, the aftermath of his public humiliation, and the way this encounter would change the lives of everyone involved. Would the waiter learn a valuable lesson, or would his arrogance and prejudice cost him everything? Stay tuned to find out what happens next. The tension in the air was thick. The waiter, once so full of himself, now stood frozen, his face a mix of confusion and fear. The manager's stern gaze was enough to make anyone feel the weight of the situation. Sarah watched the interaction, her heart racing, as she tried to piece together what was happening. She had no idea her husband had kept something so significant from her, and now, the reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. Her husband, ever the calm and composed figure, didn't speak a word at first. The silence between them all felt suffocating. Sarah could tell by the slight twitch in his jaw that he was angry, though he wasn't showing it openly. He wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice or acted impulsively. He had his own way of handling things, and right now that way seemed to involve making sure the situation didn't spiral out of control. But Sarah could sense that this was no small matter. She had never seen him look at someone with such coldness. The waiter's eyes flickered nervously between Sarah and her husband, the magnitude of his mistake finally dawning on him. He had crossed a line that couldn't be erased, and he knew it. The realization was like a punch to the gut. Sarah's mind raced with 1,000 questions. How could this have happened? Why did the waiter treat her with such disdain? And why hadn't her husband told her about his connection to the restaurant? But before she could voice any of her thoughts, the manager broke the silence. "I'll have a word with you in the back," the manager said to the waiter, his voice cold but controlled. There was no anger, just a quiet authority. The waiter nodded, his face flushed with embarrassment, and quickly retreated to the back of the restaurant, likely to face whatever consequences awaited him. The manager turned to Sarah and her husband. His face softened slightly, but the tension still hung in the air. "I am deeply sorry for the way he treated you," he said sincerely. "That behavior is completely unacceptable, and I assure you, it will be dealt with." Sarah nodded, still in shock. She wanted to say something, to ask questions, but she couldn't quite find the words. Her husband placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but even that couldn't dispel the unease she felt. There was so much she didn't know, so much that was being left unsaid. She looked at her husband, her brow furrowed. This wasn't just a simple case of bad service. This was personal. She could feel it in her bones. The manager, sensing that the situation needed to be diffused, cleared his throat. "If you'd like, I can have the meal on the house as an apology for the way things went. Please, allow me to make it up to you in any way I can." Sarah's husband spoke up then, his voice calm but firm. "That won't be necessary," he said, his tone indicating that there was no point in offering compensation for what had just happened. "Just make sure this doesn't happen again." The manager nodded, understanding the unspoken message. He turned to leave, but before he did, he glanced back at Sarah. "Again, I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience, Mom." As he disappeared into the back of the restaurant, Sarah turned to her husband, a flood of questions finally breaking through her calm exterior. "What just happened?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Why didn't you tell me about your connection to this place?" Her husband took a deep breath. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the table, his hand resting on the edge, as if weighing his words. It was clear that this wasn't something he had intended to share with her tonight. "I didn't think it was relevant," he said, his voice soft but serious. "But now, it seems it's the right time to explain." Sarah waited, her curiosity mounting. She could tell that whatever he was about to say would change everything. "For the past few years, I've been involved with this restaurant, but not as a customer," he began slowly. "I'm part of the ownership team. I've been helping to run things behind the scenes, making sure everything stays in line. The waiter, he has no idea who you are, who you're married to. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I didn't think it mattered." Sarah felt a chill run through her. Her mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The waiter's attitude wasn't just about her. There was something else at play here. She had always known that her husband's work took up a significant portion of his life, but this was different. He had kept this side of his world separate from her. And now she understood why. The power dynamics at play, the way the staff treated him, and the way they must have viewed him. It all made sense. "But why didn't you tell me?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why keep this from me?" Her husband hesitated again, as though the weight of his decision was still weighing heavily on him. "I didn't want you to feel like you were involved in all this business. It's a world that's different from what you know, and I didn't want it to affect our life. I thought it was better to keep the two worlds separate." But Sarah couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her chest. This wasn't just about business. It was about respect. The waiter had disrespected her not just because of her choices, but because he didn't recognize her place in this whole operation. And now Sarah could see that her husband's world was far more complex than she had ever realized. There were layers to this situation, and she was only beginning to uncover them. As the waiter returned, looking even more disheveled than before, Sarah could sense that the entire restaurant had shifted. The moment he stepped back into the dining area, he looked different, nervous, on edge, almost like he was walking on eggshells. He didn't look at Sarah or her husband, but his body language said it all. He was terrified. And in a way, Sarah couldn't help but feel a slight sense of vindication. The waiter approached their table cautiously, eyes downcast, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, I apologize for my behavior earlier. I shouldn't have treated you that way. It was wrong, and I understand if you're upset." Sarah stared at him, her emotions still in a whirl. She wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet, not when there were so many unanswered questions. She turned to her husband, searching for some kind of resolution. But he wasn't looking at the waiter. Instead, his gaze was fixed on something else entirely. "Why don't you explain to your colleague exactly what the consequences are for someone who behaves like you did?" her husband said, his voice carrying a level of authority that Sarah had never heard before. The waiter's face drained of color, and his hands trembled slightly. He looked between Sarah and her husband, his heart racing. But before he could speak, the manager emerged from the back, his face more serious than ever. "I've spoken to the staff," the manager said, his tone final. "He'll be placed on probation. If his behavior doesn't improve, he'll be let go. It's not just about the service, it's about respect. And as you've shown tonight, respect is something that we take very seriously here." The waiter nodded quickly, his eyes still wide with fear. He gave a brief, stiff apology to Sarah, but she could tell that the words were just that, words. There was no sincerity behind them. The damage had already been done. As they prepared to leave, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than met the eye. Why had the waiter been so aggressive towards her? What did it really mean for her husband's role in the restaurant? And most importantly, what would happen next? She could feel the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on her as they walked out into the cool night air. What Sarah didn't know was that this encounter was only the beginning. The ripple effects of what had just happened would soon spread, and the consequences of the waiter's actions would be felt far beyond the walls of the restaurant. As the story unfolded, more secrets would come to light. Secrets that would challenge everything Sarah thought she knew about her husband, his business, and the world they shared. But for now, all she could do was wait and wonder, what would be the true cost of this humiliating moment? As Sarah and her husband walked out of the restaurant, the cool night air hit her like a slap in the face. She had been so caught up in everything that had happened inside that she hadn't even noticed how tense her shoulders had become. The weight of the evening was pressing down on her with every step they took, but what unsettled her the most was the silence. Neither of them spoke as they made their way to the car. The parking lot was dimly lit, the few cars scattered around making the area feel eerily empty. Sarah's mind was spinning. She couldn't understand why her husband hadn't told her about his involvement in the restaurant before. It wasn't just the fact that she'd been treated badly by the waiter. It was the realization that her husband had kept this whole world hidden from her. How could he have kept something so significant from her? And why hadn't he mentioned it earlier? She knew him to be an honest man. He was always straightforward with her, always communicated. But this was different. It wasn't just a secret. It was something that now that she understood it, seemed like it should have been impossible to ignore. They reached the car, and Sarah slid into the passenger seat, still lost in her thoughts. Her husband got in behind the wheel, and for a long time, there was nothing but the hum of the engine as they began to drive in silence. Then, finally, her husband spoke. "I know you're upset," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I didn't want you to be part of all this. I wanted to protect you from the complications. The dynamics at that restaurant, well, they're not something I want to burden you with." But Sarah's emotions were bubbling over. "Protect me," she repeated, her voice rising despite herself. "How is keeping me in the dark protecting me? You could have told me. We're married, we're supposed to be a team. You don't just leave me in the dark about something this important. This is more than just a job to you, isn't it? This is a whole other world that I know nothing about, and now I'm left to figure it out on my own." Her words hung in the air, heavier than she expected. She looked out the window, watching the passing lights blur into streaks of yellow and white, her thoughts tangled with frustration. It wasn't just the waiter anymore. It was everything, the hidden pieces of her husband's life that she was only now starting to glimpse. Her husband didn't respond right away. He turned the steering wheel, guiding the car down a familiar street, but his silence only made Sarah feel more isolated, as if they were both in the same space, but still so far apart. After a few moments, he sighed deeply, as though trying to gather the courage to say something. "There's more to it than that," he said finally, his tone softer now, more vulnerable. "You don't know everything, Sarah. There are reasons I kept this from you. Some things I just didn't want to drag you into. You're not supposed to know the depths of what's really going on behind the scenes." Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of his words. "What do you mean? What's really going on behind the scenes? Why is it all such a secret?" He glanced over at her, and for the first time that night, his eyes were filled with uncertainty. "It's not as simple as you think. There are people involved who you wouldn't want to get mixed up with. And the restaurant, it's more than just a place to eat. It's a front for other things I can't explain right now." Sarah felt her stomach churn. This was the last thing she'd expected. She had always trusted her husband. He was the steady, reliable one in their relationship, the one who had it all together. But now she was beginning to feel like she had no idea who he really was. The layers of his life, the ones he kept hidden from her, were unraveling in a way that was terrifying. She didn't know what was worse, the thought that her husband was involved in something shady, or the fact that she had been kept completely out of the loop. She opened her mouth to say something, but her words stuck in her throat. As if reading her mind, her husband continued, "The waiter, the way he treated you, it's not just about bad service. It's deeper. He's been under pressure for a while. His behavior isn't just about his attitude. It's a part of something bigger that he doesn't understand, something he's been roped into. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. What are you saying? Is he connected to whatever's been going on behind the scenes at the restaurant? Is that why he treated me like that? Her husband's grip tightened on the steering wheel. I don't want you to get involved in any of this, but now that you've seen it for yourself, I need to tell you. The restaurant isn't just about food and customers. It's a way for certain people to move their business, things that have nothing to do with me or my team. But we're all tangled in it now. Sarah's mind was racing. She didn't know whether she should feel angry, scared, or betrayed. This was too much. She had trusted her husband, and now she was learning that there were layers to his life that she never could have imagined. So the waiter, he's just a small piece of the puzzle, isn't he? He's just one of many people who are wrapped up in this mess. Her husband nodded slowly. He's a part of it, yes. And now, because of what he did, we're all exposed. The words felt like a punch to the gut. Sarah wanted to scream. She had been pulled into this world without her consent. It wasn't just the waiter's behavior that had shaken her. It was the realization that her husband had known about this all along, had kept it hidden from her for reasons she still didn't fully understand. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. How had he allowed this to go on for so long without telling her? How could he have kept her in the dark like this, all while dealing with people who were involved in what? Crime, corruption. Her mind was swimming with questions, and now she realized something else. This wasn't just about one incident at a restaurant. It was about her entire life being unknowingly tied to something dangerous, something far beyond what she could handle. She had walked into a trap without even knowing it. The car came to a stop at a red light, and her husband's phone buzzed on the dashboard. He glanced at it, his expression hardening as he read the message. His eyes flickered with something Sarah couldn't quite place. "That's from the manager," he said, his voice now clipped and tense. "We've got a bigger problem." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What's happened now?" Her husband didn't answer right away. He just stared at the phone, his mind clearly racing. The weight of the situation was sinking in. Something was about to go down, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. Before she could ask any more questions, the car started moving again, but the world outside felt different. The streets seemed darker, the air thicker with tension. Something was closing in, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of something that could change everything. The light ahead turned green, and her husband's foot pressed harder on the gas. They were speeding toward an unknown destination, one where she could only guess at the outcome. But deep down, Sarah knew that the consequences of tonight were only just beginning to unfold. The car sped through the quiet streets, the hum of the engine almost deafening in the silence that had settled between them. Sarah's mind was still reeling, processing everything her husband had just said. He was part of something bigger. The waiter's behavior was just a glimpse into a world she didn't even know existed. But her husband's words felt incomplete, like pieces of a puzzle she wasn't yet able to see in full. As much as she tried to make sense of it all, the fear of the unknown gnawed at her. Her heart raced as they approached a familiar intersection, one that led toward their home. But instead of turning left as they normally would, her husband turned right. Sarah's stomach dropped, and she instinctively gripped the armrest, her eyes narrowing as she tried to understand why they were going this way. This wasn't the route they usually took. It was darker here, and the neighborhood felt more desolate, the buildings taller and more imposing. She turned to him, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay composed. "Where are we going?" Her husband's jaw tightened, and he didn't look at her. "I need to check something." The urgency in his voice sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Something was wrong, and the fact that he wasn't offering any explanations made her more anxious by the second. The streets grew quieter, and the buildings around them seemed to grow more rundown as they ventured deeper into the unfamiliar part of town. It felt like they were heading into a place where no one was supposed to be. "Check something. What are you talking about?" Sarah repeated, her voice cracking. "What's going on?" Her husband's grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled, his eyes focused on the road ahead. He didn't respond, and the silence between them felt suffocating. Sarah's mind was racing. The fear that had been building inside her now had a sharp edge to it. Why was he taking her here? What could possibly be so important that it couldn't wait until tomorrow? She had never seen him like this. So distant, so tense. The car slowed as they approached a small, nondescript building tucked away behind an overgrown alley. It was a warehouse of some sort, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a forgotten corner of town. Far from the hustle and bustle of the city, it was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of place that screamed secrecy. Her husband stopped the car in front of the building, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest. "Why are we here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What is this place?" He finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I can't explain everything right now. But you need to understand, this is bigger than you think. This place, it's where everything connects. The restaurant, the people, the business I've been telling you about. It all leads here." His words hit her like a wave. "What do you mean everything connects?" Sarah pressed, her mind spinning. "What are you talking about? What is really going on here?" Before he could answer, the sound of footsteps approaching the car cut through the tension. Sarah's eyes snapped to the rearview mirror, and she saw a figure emerging from the shadows. A tall man with a dark coat, his face obscured by the dim streetlights. She couldn't make out his features, but the way he moved, purposeful, confident, sent a wave of unease through her. The man came closer, and Sarah's husband didn't move, didn't speak. It was as if he was waiting for the man to approach. "Stay in the car," he said, his voice low and firm. "And don't get out." Sarah's heart was in her throat. Her pulse was pounding in her ears, and her entire body felt on edge. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are we here with him?" Her husband's gaze flickered toward the man, and then back to Sarah. "Just trust me," he said quietly. But the words didn't bring comfort. In fact, they made Sarah feel even more uncertain. The man reached the car and tapped on the window, and her husband rolled it down just a few inches, enough to allow the man to speak without fully entering the vehicle. The man leaned down, his face still hidden in shadow. Sarah couldn't hear the words at first, but the tone was unmistakable, low, urgent, and filled with tension. Her husband's response was a series of short, clipped words. They were talking about something Sarah couldn't fully understand. But what she did understand was the way her husband's eyes shifted nervously, the way his fingers drummed on the steering wheel as he listened to the man. It was clear that something important was happening, something she wasn't supposed to be a part of. The man nodded once, then turned and disappeared into the shadows without saying another word. Her husband sat there for a moment, his face tense, before he started the car again. He didn't speak as they drove away from the warehouse. The streets outside were still silent, but the tension in the air felt thick enough to cut with a knife. As they turned the corner, Sarah couldn't hold it in any longer. "What the hell was that?" she demanded. "Who was that man? What's going on? Why are we involved in all this?" Her husband's grip tightened again, and his jaw clenched so hard it looked like it might crack. "You're asking too many questions, Sarah," he said, his voice tight. "I told you, you don't need to know all of this." "I do need to know," Sarah shouted, her anger bubbling over. "I've been kept in the dark long enough. I deserve to know what's going on. This is my life too. Why are we doing this? What is it all for?" Her husband didn't respond immediately. The weight of her words hung in the air like a cloud, but the look on his face told her everything she needed to know. He was hiding something, something so important that he was willing to risk their entire relationship just to keep it from her. "Do you want to know the truth?" he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't just keep this from you because I wanted to protect you. I kept it from you because it's dangerous. What's going on here? It's bigger than either of us, and there are people involved who won't hesitate to make sure you don't get in the way. Sarah felt a cold chill wash over her. The words hung in the air, and the full weight of their meaning was just beginning to settle in. Her husband was involved in something dangerous, something much more than a few shady dealings at a restaurant. This was real. People's lives were at stake, and it wasn't just the waiter or the manager she needed to worry about anymore. She needed to worry about the man her husband had become, and the world he had brought her into without her even knowing it. Before she could ask another question, her phone buzzed. She pulled it out, and her blood ran cold when she saw the message. It was from an unknown number, but the message was clear. You shouldn't have come here. You've made a dangerous mistake. Her hand shook as she looked at her husband, the realization dawning on her. They weren't just at the edge of something. They were already deep inside it. And now, there was no turning back. The world they had stepped into was far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined, and every move they made would only draw them closer to a climax she wasn't prepared for. Sarah's fingers trembled as she held her phone, the words on the screen still lingering in her mind. You shouldn't have come here. You've made a dangerous mistake. The text was a warning, but it was also a threat, one that made her realize just how deep her husband's world ran. She looked at him, her stomach twisting with fear and confusion. His eyes were locked on the road, his face tense, as though he was bracing for something he couldn't control. We're almost there, he said, his voice tight, as if he was trying to keep himself composed for both of them. Where is there, exactly? Sarah asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and panic. What is happening? Why didn't you tell me this was dangerous? What did you get us into? Her husband didn't answer, his jaw clenched so hard it looked painful. The silence between them was thick with unspoken truths, and Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the evening. The waiter's hostility, the dark alleyway, the mysterious man at the warehouse. Everything was connected. But what exactly was the link? The car took another sharp turn, and Sarah found herself staring at an old, run-down building looming ahead. The lights were dim, and the windows were covered in grime, giving it a sense of abandonment. But Sarah could tell that it wasn't abandoned. There were shadows moving inside. Her husband pulled up to the entrance, and as he parked, the air seemed to grow colder, heavier. She could feel the weight of the danger pressing in, and her heart pounded as she turned to him, desperate for answers. Please, she whispered, tell me what's going on. Her husband's eyes softened for a brief moment, but then they hardened again. I didn't want you to know, Sarah, but I can't keep hiding this from you. This isn't just about the restaurant. It's bigger than that. The people involved. They won't stop. You've already seen too much. Her pulse quickened. She was right. This wasn't just about a waiter with an attitude. This was about a web of lies and secrets that her husband had been entangled in for far too long. So what now? She asked, her voice shaking. What are we supposed to do? Before her husband could answer, the car door opened, and two men stepped out of the shadows. One was tall, with a scar running down his cheek, the other shorter but stockier, his arms crossed over his chest. They moved with purpose, their eyes locked on the car. Her husband nodded at them, his face grim. They've been waiting for us. Waiting for us. Sarah's voice barely registered the words, her mind still trying to catch up. The taller man approached her side of the car. You shouldn't have gotten involved, Mom, he said coldly. Now there's no going back. Before Sarah could respond, her husband quickly exited the car and began walking toward the building. Sarah, feeling a mix of fear and confusion, hesitated for a moment before following him. The men stayed behind, watching from a distance, but they didn't stop her. It was clear that this wasn't about her anymore. This was about something much larger than her, and much darker. As they entered the building, Sarah felt the weight of every step. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. The hallway was narrow and dimly lit, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and something metallic she couldn't place. They walked down a long corridor that seemed to stretch forever. Her husband stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall and turned to face her. "You need to stay here," he said, his voice low. "I can't let you see what's inside." "No." The word slipped from Sarah's lips before she could stop herself. "I'm not staying behind. I'm in this now, too. I need to know." Her husband's eyes softened for a moment, and for the first time that night, Sarah saw a flicker of the man she had married, the man she thought she knew. But that moment was fleeting. He turned away, his face hardening again as he pushed open the door. The room inside was small, and it smelled like smoke and something else she couldn't place. There were two men inside, sitting at a table, their expressions unreadable. One was holding a briefcase, the other a file. Sarah's husband stepped forward and exchanged a few quiet words with them. She strained to hear but couldn't catch the conversation. The tension in the room was suffocating, and her mind raced with questions. What were they talking about? What had her husband gotten involved in? Then, without warning, one of the men at the table stood up abruptly and pulled a gun from his waistband, pointing it directly at her husband. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. Her husband's face didn't change. He didn't flinch. "You don't need to do this," he said calmly, his voice unwavering. "We can still fix this." The man with the gun sneered. "Fix this?" He spat. "You're too deep, man. You think we can just forget about all the mistakes you've made. It's too late for that." Before Sarah could react, the second man standing by the table raised his hand. "Wait," he said, his voice sharp. "Let's hear him out." The man with the gun hesitated but didn't lower it. There was a moment of dead silence before the man with the briefcase finally spoke, his voice cold and final. "We've been watching you. You were always just a pawn in this game. But now you've become a liability." Her husband didn't flinch. He kept his eyes locked on the man who held the gun, his expression unreadable. Sarah felt as though her chest was being crushed under the weight of everything happening in front of her. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to see any of this. And then, as if by instinct, her husband stepped forward, his movements fast and controlled. He grabbed the gunman's arm and twisted it, forcing him to drop the weapon with a loud crash. In the split second that followed, everything seemed to freeze. The other man lunged at her husband, but Sarah's husband was faster. He grabbed the man by the throat and slammed him into the wall, his face twisted with determination. "Listen to me," he shouted, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't have to do this. I've given you everything. You wanted loyalty. You wanted control. But I'm done." For the first time, Sarah realized the truth. Her husband hadn't just been a part of this world. He had been running it. He had been the one pulling the strings. Everything, from the waiter's attitude to the shady deals at the restaurant, had been part of his plan. Her heart dropped. Her husband hadn't just been hiding from her. He had been lying about who he truly was. He wasn't the man she thought he was. And just as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, the unexpected twist hit. The man who had been standing behind her husband, the one who hadn't said a word until now, spoke up. "Get out of the way, man," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think you've won. You've just been played." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The truth hit her like a ton of bricks. Her husband wasn't just a player in this world. He had been played too. Before she could process the revelation, a shot rang out, and everything went dark. The shot echoed in the small room, ringing in Sarah's ears as she instinctively ducked, her body frozen in place. For a moment, everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. The world around her blurred, the chaos unfolding before her in a dizzying spiral of confusion. Her heart was pounding in her chest, every breath shallow as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. Her eyes darted around the room. Her husband was still standing, facing the man who had just spoken, but now he was slowly slumping to the ground, his hand pressed to his side. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining his shirt in a dark, ominous pool. The man who had fired the shot stood there, his gun still raised, his expression unreadable. "No!" Sarah screamed, rushing forward despite her instinct to stay hidden. She reached her husband just as he crumpled to the floor. Her hands shook as she tried to stop the bleeding, but the wound was deep. Her husband's face was pale, his breathing ragged, but he managed to lift his hand to her cheek. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered weakly. "I never wanted this. For you." Tears blurred her vision as she pressed her hand against his wound, but it was clear that the damage was too severe. She could feel his life slipping away, and the weight of everything that had happened. The lies, the secrets, the dangers he had put them both in, crashed down on her in a wave of grief and anger. "I should have told you the truth," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I didn't want to drag you into this, but I was too far gone. I thought I could protect you, but..." His words trailed off, and Sarah's heart broke. She could see the regret in his eyes, the man he had been, and the man he was now, laid bare in those final moments. She had wanted answers, but now they felt hollow. She had wanted to know why, but there were no more answers to be had. The men who had been standing nearby remained motionless, watching the scene unfold with cold detachment. Sarah's hands were trembling, her mind racing as she looked from one man to the next, trying to make sense of everything. The man with the scar who had been so hostile earlier stepped forward, his gaze flicking toward her husband's lifeless body. "You're too late," he said simply. "You should have stayed out of this." Sarah's eyes flashed with fury. "What is it that you want? What is all of this for?" Her voice was hoarse, thick with emotion, but she wasn't going to let them off the hook. Not without answers. The scared man smirked. "What we want? That's a simple question. But you won't get an answer from me." He knew what we were about, and he chose to play along. In the end, though, he was just another casualty in a much bigger game. Sarah's mind whirled, the words not quite making sense to her. It wasn't just about the restaurant, or even the waiter's attitude. There was something deeper, something far more dangerous that her husband had gotten involved in. A criminal network, a world she had no idea he was a part of. And now, with his death, the pieces she had been trying to put together all night were slipping through her fingers, too broken to reconstruct. The man with the briefcase stepped forward, his eyes scanning her with a cold, calculating look. "You were never meant to be a part of this," he said. "But now that you are, well, I guess that's the price you pay for getting too close." Sarah's mind raced. There had to be a way out. She couldn't just let it end like this. Not after everything that had happened. She looked at her husband's body one last time, feeling the weight of the loss settle over her. She had trusted him. She had believed in him. And now she was left to deal with the aftermath. But before she could process everything, the sound of sirens pierced the air, and the building began to shake with the sound of approaching vehicles. Her heart skipped a beat. The law? No, not the police. Something else was happening. The men in the room reacted quickly. They exchanged hurried glances, their earlier confidence replaced with a tinge of panic. They had underestimated one thing: Sarah. As the sirens grew louder, they turned their attention back to her. One of them cursed under his breath and headed toward the back door. The other reached for the briefcase, preparing to leave. But Sarah wasn't going to let them go. She couldn't, not without making them understand what they had done. With a surge of adrenaline, she lunged for the briefcase in the man's hands, her fingers just grazing the edge. For a moment, they struggled, but Sarah was fueled by the fury of everything that had happened. The man's grip faltered, and she yanked the briefcase away. Her heart was pounding, her breathing shallow as she opened it, hoping to find something, anything, that would give her the leverage she needed. Inside the briefcase, instead of papers, there was a thick stack of money and a small encrypted device. Sarah's eyes widened as she realized that this was more than just a simple criminal operation. This was a network that reached farther than she had ever imagined. People who had the power to control and destroy lives with no remorse. The man who had been trying to escape turned back, eyes wide in shock as he saw the contents of the briefcase. "Give that back," he yelled, but Sarah held it tightly, her expression unwavering. The sirens were now deafening, and the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the building. They were running out of time. The man tried to lunge for the briefcase, but before he could reach her, the door to the building burst open, and a group of armed officers stormed in. Sarah barely had time to process what was happening before the men were pinned to the ground, their plans unraveling faster than they could react. As the officers cuffed the men and secured the area, Sarah took a deep breath, her whole body shaking. It was over. The nightmare was over. The officers looked at Sarah, recognizing her from the reports they had gotten about her husband's involvement. They asked her questions, but she didn't have all the answers. All she knew was that her life had been turned upside down in a matter of hours, and her world was never going to be the same. In the end, Sarah walked away from that place, her hands still trembling but her mind clear. She had lost so much, but she had also gained something, an understanding of just how deep betrayal could run. And as she looked at the wreckage of her past, she vowed to move forward, stronger and wiser, with the knowledge that sometimes the truth comes at a steep price. Her life would never be the same, but she would find a way to heal. And maybe, just maybe, she would be able to take the lessons of the past and use them to rebuild her future.